Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into one of the most unbelievable turnarounds in global history, the shocking speed at which Britain lost its entire American empire. We're talking about a time frame of literally just 10 years, a decade that took Britain from standing as this globally triumphant superpower in 1763 to standing on the absolute brink of all-out war by 1773.
Just imagine being the undisputed superpower of the world, right? And then watching your absolute most valuable asset just slip right through your fingers in the blink of an eye. How exactly did a victorious, expanding empire manage to trigger a catastrophic rebellion in a single decade? What was the wedge that drove so deeply between the British government and its 2 million completely prosperous American colonists that they ultimately decided to take up arms? Well, let's unpack exactly why Britain struggled so hard to maintain control.
Section 1. The Cost of Victory. To really understand this rebellion, we've got to rewind to the state of the British Empire in 1763, right after they won the massive global 7 Years' War against their bitter French and Spanish rivals. Britain came out of this conflict claiming huge chunks of new territory all over the globe, but especially in North America. France was essentially forced to give up almost all its colonies, handing Britain 3 million square miles of land. To put that into perspective, that's an area roughly the size of all of Europe. But, as you can imagine, this incredible victory brought absolutely unprecedented defense costs. These new vast frontiers were highly volatile. You had bitter European rivals looking for literally any chance to reverse Britain's gains, and Native American tribes posed a very serious threat. This was vividly demonstrated right in 1763 when Chief Pontiac led a bloody revolt, attacking every single British fort west of the Appalachians.
Defending an empire of that sheer scale? Yeah, it's not cheap. And the massive cost of that recent war had ballooned Britain's national debt to an absolute crisis level. Get this, interest payments alone were consuming more than half of Britain's entire annual spending. That's just the interest. So the British government was in a desperate financial hole, and they needed to find a solution, and they needed it fast.
And when you look at the sheer disparity in the numbers, you can kind of see their thought process. The British government looked across the Atlantic at its 13 American colonies, which, by the way, were absolutely booming in terms of population and prosperity, and they saw a very logical piggy bank. I mean, an average Briton over in England paid 26 shillings a year in tax, while a New Englander paid just 1 single shilling. So from London's perspective, it seemed perfectly reasonable to expect the colonists to finally start pitching in to help meet the massive cost of their very own defense.
Moving on to Section 2. The tax collision course. So the British Prime Minister at the time, George Grenville, decided he was the guy to fix the spiraling debt. But his attempts would very quickly turn a financial problem into a total existential crisis. To understand why the colonists reacted so strongly, we really have to look at the historical status quo. For 157 years, the relationship between Britain and America had been defined by something called salutary neglect. Basically, the British government had largely just left the colonies alone to manage their own affairs, mainly because London was focused on much more lucrative spots like the West Indies and India. Because of this long-standing hands-off approach, the American culture had grown highly enterprising, really self-confident, and vastly less deferential to the motherland. They were totally used to just ruling themselves.
So when Britain suddenly decided to just drop this century-old hands-off approach, the cultural shock was profound. Grenville pushed through the Sugar Act in 1764 to really enforce tax collection, and then the Stamp Act in 1765, which specifically taxed commercial and legal documents. Now, the British honestly expected very little fuss. After all, Englishmen at home had been paying similar taxes for 70 years, but the uproar in the colonies was literally deafening. The Stamp Act specifically hit highly influential people. We're talking merchants, lawyers, business owners. They quickly organized boycotts that absolutely crippled trade, ultimately forcing a new British Prime Minister to repeal the acts in 1766. But on the exact same day, Parliament made a stubborn and frankly fatal misstep. They passed the Declaratory Act, asserting they had absolute authority to bind the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The storm had paused for a second, but the clouds were only getting darker.
This brings us to Section 3, the representation debate.
I want to pause this historical timeline for just a second here to really drill down into exactly why Britain struggled so mightily to maintain control over its North American colonies. Because it wasn't actually just about the money. It was a fundamental, totally irreconcilable political wedge that was driving the two sides apart. The whole debate centered on the very definition of representation itself. Prime Minister Grenville argued for this concept called virtual representation, which is the idea that members of Parliament represent the general interests of all British subjects, regardless of who actually elected them. But the American colonists, they completely rejected that. They absolutely demanded direct consent. They argued that as British subjects, their constitutional rights were actively being trampled on, and that's where their famous unified cry came from: no taxation without representation.
The figure who really brought this colonial demand to life with absolute fire was Patrick Henry. Down in the Virginia House of Burgesses, he emerged as this radical leader of resistance. He proposed resolutions that explicitly stated that taxation by chosen representatives was the absolute only security a people had against burdensome taxation. For the colonists, the principle of direct consent wasn't just a talking point, it was absolutely everything to them.
But, it's really vital to note here that this debate wasn't strictly geographic. There were actually very powerful voices over in England who agreed entirely with the colonists' view of representation. Even the renowned former British Prime Minister Pitt the Elder stood right up in Parliament and attacked Grenville's whole theory of virtual representation. He actually called the British system, where whole boroughs had no actual voters, the rotten part of the Constitution, and he emphatically agreed that Parliament had zero right to lay a tax upon the colonies.
All right, Section 4, the path to violence.
So, with this unresolvable ideological split firmly established, the situation on the ground rapidly escalated from polite political debates into full-on physical confrontation. The resistance was getting highly organized and, frankly, increasingly violent. Communities were literally splitting into two camps. You had the Loyalists, who just wanted to avoid confrontation with Parliament, and the Patriots, who actively resisted. Groups like the Sons of Liberty up in New England, led by famous figures like Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and Paul Revere, started taking really aggressive action. Tax collectors were beaten, they were driven out of town, or they were subjected to the horrific punishment of tarring and feathering. That's where victims were literally covered in scalding hot tar and paraded through the streets. It was brutal.
Parliament tried again in 1767, passing the Townshend Acts to raise revenue and reassert their authority. And well, the backlash was immediate. To try and quell the unrest, British troops were actually sent into Boston, which led directly to the Boston Massacre in March of 1770. That's where a really tense, snowball-throwing mob caused a small detachment of British soldiers to lose their nerve and fire into the crowd, killing 5 locals. And tensions flared right back up again in 1772. Local smugglers, who were absolutely furious over aggressive Royal Navy inspections and being put on trial in special military courts, actually boarded and burned the British schooner HMS Gosby. The entire cycle of rebellion and crackdowns was just completely spinning out of control.
Which leads us to Section 5, the breaking point.
We finally reached the ultimate catalyst in 1773 that pushed this entire conflict completely past the point of peaceful resolution. And ironically enough, the trigger wasn't actually meant to punish the colonies at all. It was just a corporate bailout. The East India Company, which was the empire's absolute largest corporation, was teetering right on the verge of bankruptcy. So Parliament passed the Tea Act of 1773. It basically gave the company the right to sell tea directly to America with tariff exemptions, making it way cheaper than smuggled tea. But, crucially, it kept a small 3-pence tax in place. This one singular act managed to simultaneously threaten the massive profits of really powerful New England smugglers, like John Hancock, while also perfectly triggering all those patriot principles we talked about regarding unrepresented taxation.
The climax finally arrived in Boston. Now, while other ports actually managed to just turn the tea ships around, the British governor in Massachusetts stubbornly refused to yield. So on a chilly December evening in 1773, members of the Sons of Liberty, famously disguised as Native Americans to symbolize their new distinct American identity, boarded the ships. They smashed open 340 chests and dumped a whopping 92,000 pounds of tea straight into Boston Harbor. To put that into perspective for you today, that destroyed cargo would be worth a staggering $2 million.
The Boston Tea Party completely fractured whatever last remaining ties there were between the two sides. When you look at the different reactions, it's like they were watching two completely different events. Patriot lawyer John Adams celebrated it. He called it a magnificent movement and a sublime effort of the people doing something that had to be remembered. But the British government? They looked at that exact same event and saw nothing but lawlessness, pure mob rule, and a completely outrageous attack on private property. For London, this was definitively the final straw. They decided their authority was in tatters, the time for restraint was officially over, and the gloves were finally coming off.
So, we've seen exactly how taxation policies, fundamentally conflicting views on direct versus virtual representation, and a rapidly escalating cycle of violent resistance managed to completely dismantle a colonial relationship in just 10 short years. But looking at how deeply entrenched both sides had become by 1773, it leaves us with a huge question. Once an empire decides the time for restraint is truly over, is war just inevitable? Was a peaceful reconciliation ever really possible given this explosive mix of imperial control and colonial rebellion? Think about that the next time you see any nation try to significantly tighten its grip. Let us know what you think in the comments, and as always, keep exploring.